Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Langguth. I am a staff technical adoption manager at VMware, focused on our end user computing product set, specifically Horizon out there in the field. This session, VMTN2816LV, covering our Horizon Cloud service on Azure. So if you're here for AI or ARIA operations, wrong session. But if you're here for today for Horizon Cloud on Azure, thank you for joining us here this morning. So this is perhaps the most important slide in the deck. This is a QR code that goes out to a blog post. And while I can't share this specific deck, hint, hint, wink, wink, there is a copy available out on the blog post. And why is that important? Well, this deck contains reference links to our knowledge-based articles, TechZone documentation, and other reference architecture that is important for your Horizon Cloud on Azure adoption journey. As the product is also evolving, I'm updating the blog post as well. So as we're having new information that comes out there about the product, the blog post will get updated and the deck will be as well. So perhaps a link that you want to bookmark and have. So a little bit about my background. Again, I'm an EUC-focused technical adoption manager. For the last year and a half, I've been working with some of our largest Horizon Cloud on Azure customers. Between the two that I'm primarily working with, we have over 10,000 desktops deployed out there in multiple Azure regions. So this deck is, as you say, a kind of a best practices of what we've learned as far as support and deploying the product and whatnot that I'm here to be able to share with you today. So we talked a little bit about the background. I want to be able to share some HCOA resources that are out there, where Horizon Cloud on Azure fits within the Horizon Cloud product portfolio, some cloud considerations. So regardless of what hyperscaler you might be moving your desktops to, whether that's primary or using it for HA or disaster recovery scenarios, bigger picture, right? What you need to consider when moving desktops from on-premises out to a hyperscaler. Then we'll talk about some differences between the V1 and V2 versions of the product. Again, with HCOA, there is a fundamental difference in architecture between the first generation and second generation of the product that you need to be aware of. We'll talk about why you would want to consider deploying version 1 versus version 2, and then some of the migration options that you have if you're a current V1 customer and what that would look like to move your estate over to the next generation of the platform, and also talking about some of the timelines to go along with that. Talk about some of the reporting considerations that you need to take into consideration if you're a current V1 customer, and we'll cover some of the ways to optimize your support experience when using HCOA. So let's talk about some of the resources that are out there for this particular product. First of all, there's a demo available in two different forms, really three. We have a hands-on lab walkthrough that is free, absolutely available. Register an email address out there, and you can interact with either version 1 or version 2 of the product. Walk through, see how it works, look at the reporting interface and whatnot, and again, that's linked here. There's also a 60-day trial that is available. So I call this BYOA, Bring Your Own Azure Service. Okay, so if you want to take it to the next level and you want to do that proof of concept where you want to test out some of your images, or how does this work as far as deploying and seeing how your existing applications would work with a remote desktop that's delivered via Azure, this would be a means to do so. Again, 60-day trial that's out there, and then we also have the ability to convert that trial over to a production instance, if you would. Also want to call out our deployment guide. Some of us, I was talking with some customers here this morning of what are the technical considerations? Our reference architecture. This links out to a full-blown walkthrough and reference architecture that's out there on TechZone. And then we also have technical deep dives that are available within the TechZone section of the Horizon portfolio on the EUC TechZone. And then if you consume information maybe perhaps better in a video form, we have the VMware End User Computing YouTube channel that has several series of HCOA as far as walkthroughs and setup guides and deployments and even additional capacity, or how the product might work if you have an on-premises deployment and want to do a hybrid environment where you would have entitlements for desktops both on-premises and in the cloud. Walkthroughs there. Again, this is all linked out, and if you would download a copy of this PDF, you would be able to have these as references. So, excuse me, briefly here. So let's talk about where HCOA, and again, I'll use that acronym, so Horizon Cloud on Azure, fits within the Horizon Cloud product portfolio. I will say right away, we could have done a better job with our naming conventions here. Okay, this is a little confusing, but I want to call it out because even internally, sometimes we, let's just say, get the names confused. So there is Horizon on Azure VMware Solution. Say that 5 times fast, right? Horizon on Azure VMware Solution. Sometimes we'll call this Horizon on AVS. This is our PaaS, or Platform as a Service, or IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service offering. So this is where you're still managing the traditional on-premises Horizon stack. So your connection servers, your UAGs, right? Your app volumes managers, DEM if you're particularly using that, you are responsible for managing those particular operational elements. What VMware and Azure takes care of in this solution is the back-end core hardware infrastructure and the life cycling of vSphere, okay? But this is important to call out that these will be vSphere-based desktops. So all of the advantages that we would have with vSphere-based desktops, ESXi, VM fork technology for instant clones and whatnot. The offering that we're going to focus in on today is Horizon Cloud Service on Azure, right? HCOA, right? This is our DaaS platform, DaaS being the acronym Desktop as a Service. So in this particular instance, the only thing that you are managing is your desktop images, okay? Microsoft takes care of the infrastructure as far as the hypervisor, and VMware is managing on your behalf the broker, the UAGs, the display protocol, the DEM managers, and the app volume managers as well. It's important to call out that this is an Azure-based desktop, right? That's the key differences between these two solutions. Azure-based, as far as their hypervisor, versus Horizon on Azure VMware Solution, where it's ESXi. So if you have needs for things like instant clones, right, you would be considering Horizon on Azure VMware Solution. If you're looking to do HCOA and instant clones as part of your deployment, you might want to take into consideration maybe having more desktop deployed so that you can have that burst capacity available. So let's talk about bigger cloud considerations. Again, this is stepping away from Azure in particular, but if you're moving any type of on-premises workload over to a cloud, some things to keep in mind. So let's talk about image rationalization. So one of my colleagues, Hans Bader, has said that if you're taking your existing on-premises desktop image and moving it over to one of these hyperscalers, you're doing it wrong. I could not agree more. This is the time, as admins, to take the time to do a proper image rationalization to find out what your CPU, memory, and storage needs are. Because in some instances where we deploy a desktop deployment, right, we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a cluster infrastructure, and we try to cram as many desktops as we possibly can, right? And we don't necessarily think about those fixed costs past the initial purchase. With Azure-based desktops, you're being billed for each of those individual elements. And as your deployment starts to scale, those costs can increase exponentially. So it's very, very important to do the proper rationalization as far as your image sizing. I will touch on some of the savings that can be out there that we've ran into with a particular customer in a moment. You also have to consider what you're using for your profile management, right? And how that's going to be carried over into a hypervisor or a hyperscaler environment. Is your current deployment compatible with a hybrid environment, right? What are you going to be using for storage? How are you going to be doing replication between on-premises and that cloud, right? All items to keep in mind. I call out Windows 11 here, is many organizations are looking to move their estate to either Windows 11 as a whole or perhaps Windows 11 multi-session. Is this the time to consider that, right? Perhaps other than using Windows 10, in this limited deployment, you could use Windows 11 here to use that as an acceleration pathway to start your Windows 11 adoption for your organization. Windows 11 in both version 1 and version 2 of HCOA is fully compatible. We'll touch on a little bit of the details though with that, with some callouts there. And then of course we want to talk about your HA and DR strategy, right? Often customers want to have multiple Azure zones deployed with these desktops. But remember, and it's important to call out here, these desktops are just a means to get to that application, right? In some instances, if you can deliver the app alone, you would do so. The call out here is, if you don't have HA and DR for that particular application, what's the point of having multiple Azure zones deployed, right? So we could have it in an example, desktops in US Central and US East, but if those desktops are going to an enterprise application that's in a single data center, and that data center goes down, is it really worth the cost of having that availability between those two zones? Items to call out and to think about and have discussions with your executives about. And then of course, you need to think about how app volumes and of course apps on demand ultimately play into this strategy. Going back to our first part with image rationalization, anything that we can do to shrink that desktop OS base image results in a cost savings. So if we can start to rather than bake the application into the desktop image and deliver it via app volumes, there is potentially huge cost savings there. So let's move on to some cloud considerations that are more Azure focused. So of course we want to make sure that the region that you're deploying HCOA into or that you're considering has availability. If you follow this link out there, we're kind of vague. We say HCOA is available in most Azure regions. So the big ones that are out there, of course, over in EMEA, US Central, US West, and whatnot. But if you have that particular use case where you're trying to do a one-off deployment, always check with your VMware EUC resource to make sure HCOA is available there. We also want to talk about data and application locality. This is a giant one, right? We often see where customers want to put these desktops as close to the user as possible. That's wonderful. However, I'll go back to my previous point of it's about the applications. These are a means to get access to the applications. So if the application is in a US data center, but the desktops are in a foreign Azure zone, you're kicking the latency problem down the road, right? So a big thing to keep into consideration. And then I'm sure I see some heads out there shaking in the audience. It makes all of that troubleshooting that much more difficult. All right, we also want to talk about cross-region replication. So if you're doing multiple Azure zones, You want to make sure that there is cross-region replication for back-end things like file services to take into consideration. And of course, taking into the overall picture of IP address space and network routes as far as how these users are going to be gaining access to the environment. We also want to consider what you're using for your identity provider. Excuse me. Right now, as far as an identity provider, there is two means of doing so that are compatible. You can use a hybrid deployment where you would connect an on-premises domain controller and have a traditional IDP there that you would have through Active Directory, or you could use native user-based authentication via Azure. I had called out Windows 11 compatibility, but if your organization is using certain versions of either Windows 10 or Windows 11 that, let's say, have been approved via your InfoSec, you have to deploy certain versions of either version V1 or V2 to be compatible with that particular Windows iteration. So think of like 21H2, right, for out there for Windows 10. There is only certain versions of HCOA that are compatible with Windows 10 or Windows 11. The link here takes you to the entire matrix that's called out. And then quickly switching over to the business side, this is a great time to bring in your cloud operations team, okay? And what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes traditional Horizon operators, this is their first big project where they've worked with your organization's cloud operations team, right? They may have done some Luna deployments, but this could be the first real engagement, so to say. So they're going to have operational questions, right? Network security gateways, VNets, how that all plays into their Azure deployment. And especially, regardless of V1 or V2, we're going to be deploying elements into your Azure tenant. And the minute they hear that, the radar goes off, right? It's from both the cloud ops and the InfoSec team. So the sooner that you can get them engaged in this overall deployment, the better. Let's talk about cost savings here, okay? So I'm linking out to the Azure price calculator. If you take the exact same desktop deployment, so let's say 2 vCPU, 4 gig of RAM, maybe let's say 40 gig base OS disk, and you move that through different Azure regions, whether that's even within the US or over to EMEA or APJ, the cost can differ dramatically. So it's important as part of your overall strategy, not only with data and application locality and where they are with the users, but also to take into those cost differentiation comparisons with Azure zones. Let me give you an example here too with the desktop machine profile. I have a particular customer that has 2,000 persistent desktops deployed. Yes, I know, persistent, but the use case is out there, okay? It's justified. They have a 256 gig base OS disk. If we take that disk and we cut it in half at their discount, which is one of the highest I've ever seen as far as an Azure discount to them, the cost savings annually is over $100,000 a year just in the base OS disk. So again, this kind of plays into that image rationalization and which applications you're baking into the image versus what you can deliver via app volumes. It all adds up. Also, it's been my experience, Azure makes their money by, if the machine is running, it's charging a bill. So power management plays into this very, very critically. We have the ability to turn the machines off at user log off via idle time, and we can also set these settings at the pool level. There's a great article here that we'll call out that Rick Turlip did with our technical marketing team to detail all of those power management sessions. I also want to call out another great session here. I'd referenced Hans before, that he dives into all of these cost management strategies tomorrow afternoon. EUSB 1379. If you're not here tomorrow afternoon, this session will probably be recorded. And again, it's one to call out. Great session on cost management for the hyperscalers. So let's talk about deployment deliberations. I'm going to do a quick time check here. So with V1 versus V2, right? First of all, V1, you must request. You absolutely must request. So by default, you're going to get version 2 of the product. The big difference here, if you have endpoints that still require PC over IP, you must deploy version 1. So if you have those Teradicis that might be out there, only in version 1 is PC over IP supported, okay? Currently, also, if you want to do a hybrid deployment, so you have traditional on-premises desktop deployed, and you're looking at HCOA for burst capacity, and you want to entitle those users to both on-premises and these HCOA desktops, you have to deploy version 1. That's coming in V2 very, very shortly, but it's a current limitation. You also have to take into consideration where we're at in our timeline with deprecation of version 1, and we'll touch on that in just a minute. Okay? In version 2, again, blast only. It falls in line where we're at with the entire Horizon product portfolio, where blast will be our display protocol of choice. And there's also important here to call out that the user login sign-on workflow is a little bit different right now for version 2. So we're directing, as part of the sign-on process, all users to go to cloud.vmwarehorizon.com, and then they'll enter a domain name. So why is this important? Well, one, you might have to do some user training with that. And two, if you're using thin clients, some thin clients produce some errors with this logon workflow. A lot of the manufacturers that are out there are updating their BIOS and firmware to come around this hurdle. But again, where you're at with your endpoint management and life cycling thin clients, I know we all try to get out there and make sure that they're as current as possible, but especially with those bigger fleets, sometimes that's difficult to do. We're going to support custom domain names for that login process here shortly, but again, if you're considering V2, it's one there to call out. And we're not quite there with feature parity yet with V1 to V2. So things like proxy support. So if your InfoSec team doesn't allow direct access out to the internet from your Azure tenant, we have proxy support in V1, but not in V2 yet. And perhaps if you're a federal customer and need FedRAMP compatibility, that's not out there as well. There's an internal VMware document that you can reference with your VMware EUC resource that will compare where we're at with feature parity, and this is rapidly evolving. It's again why we kind of go back to this blog post idea, because we're very, very quickly getting to feature parity between V1 and V2. Okay, I also want to call out here where we're at with this timeline to version 2. I'll use the terms version 2, next gen, and Titan interchangeably here. They all refer to the same product. Titan was the internal code name. But recently we announced 2 key dates with version 1. Okay? The first one is 31 October. So if you're an existing V1 customer, after the 31st of October, you will not be able to deploy additional V1 pods. There is an exemption process to this, but by default, you will not be able to deploy additional pod capacity for V1. The second is 31 January of next year, where we want to be able to have all of our existing V1 customers over to V2. Again, there's an exemption process here, but by default, we're drawing a line in the sand to get customers over to that next generation platform. There is the exemption process called out here, and also our public knowledge base article that details these transitions. We'll talk about migration options. So if you're a current customer for V1, we'll do a quick chime check here, gentlemen. 2 minutes, so quick here. So you have the self-service option where you can go through, and as far as the automation, go through an entire automated deployment migration from V1 to V2. There is lots of qualifications with this. The qualification document is linked out there. It requires the latest build of V1, so you do not need to redeploy your agents. Okay, the agents automatically swing between version 1 and version 2. And the last step of the process is a confirmation. So you're allowed to check to make sure that the deployment is okay. And if it's not, you can roll back to V1. That documentation linked below, as well as the workflow detail. You can also do this as a greenfield deployment. So if you have an existing V1, you can spin up a new Azure tenant with V2, and you can point them to the same Workspace ONE access instance, so you can have a user that's entitled to a version 1 desktop and a version 2 desktop with the same Workspace ONE access instance. So that can give you some migration options there. If you're an existing V1 customer for CMS reporting, so CMS Cloud Management Service, it's important to call out that we have deprecated this reporting and we have moved over to Workspace ONE Intelligence. Okay, so if you haven't gone into the console lately or haven't done some reporting, this was deprecated 30 June of this year. You must migrate over to Workspace ONE Intelligence. As part of your licensing, you get a Workspace ONE Intelligence License Standard Edition for free. If you're starting out net new with V2, you don't have to worry about this migration. Good to go. And quickly, I want to talk about support, okay? So just like we would have with a UEM environment, perhaps you want to deploy a UAT here, right? There's nothing stopping you from doing that as far as a development environment that you would have with additional capacity. Spin up a tenant, and you can use that for life cycling of both checking those upgrade processes and doing testing as far as individual OS updates and whatnot. Another really important one here to call out as far as your support experience is HAR logs. HAR is an acronym, HTTP Access Request. Every one of the major browsers has this ability to capture HAR logs. If you see an error in the Horizon Cloud Control Plane console, one of the first things support will ask you to do is capture the HAR logs. This link here will take you to a knowledge base article that shows you, regardless of browser, how to capture those logs. If you include them with your support ticket to begin with, you're already ahead of the game, right? You're not in that back and forth between support. So capture the HAR logs if you see something that's in an error, all right? We also want to call out release notes between version 1 and version 2. If you do some Google searching there, sometimes you can get confused of where they're at. And then the service status page is somewhat confusing of where it's at because it's linked within our Workspace ONE status page. The link to where we're at as far as the Horizon Cloud Control Plane is linked here in this deck as well. So again, we covered that quick agenda. We talked about what HCOA resources are out there, how it fits in the Horizon Cloud product portfolio, some cloud considerations as far as cost, items to cover between V1 and V2, why you might want to do version 1 versus version 2, how you would migrate if you're a current existing customer, some reporting considerations, and some best supports that it's out there. Want to call out the next session that's coming up. If you're interested in HCOA, a great tech deep dive up here at 10:15 with Rick Turlip and Graham Gordon, okay? One to definitely call out. And finally, I'll leave that QR code up there that links out to that blog post. If you didn't answer your question today, please reach out onto the artist that's formerly known as Twitter or the LinkedIn, my LinkedIn profile. Happy to answer questions that are out there. Thank you, folks. Appreciate the time this morning, and have a great, great Explore.